They captured her alive, salt in her hair, smoke in her throat, the rope cutting into the soft skin at her wrists as men shoved her into a long, low ship. She tasted iron and sea and the ash of what had been her home that morning. Her feet slipped on blood-slicked boards. Someone laughed at the narrowness of her chest as she was hauled beneath a sail that smelled of tar and sweating wool. For a moment she tried to imagine escape, a tree line, a hidden crevice, a neighbor's hand. Then the oars began their steady rhythm, and the coast slid away like a scene from a life she had once owned. This is not a single cruelty replayed in isolation. Her abduction was an act in a larger enterprise, an economic strategy, an organized system that treated living bodies as cargo. What followed? Forced labor, erasure of legal identity, sexual servitude, children born into bondage, and for some, rituals that ended in death, amounted, for countless women, to a life worse than dying. Historians and archaeologists, piecing together laws, sagas, burial mounds, isotopes, and DNA, now read a bleak ledger. Expansion and wealth built on stolen lives. Content warning: this program will discuss historical sexual exploitation, forced servitude, and ritualized killings. Details are presented in measured language and with evidence-based context. Viewer discretion is advised. If this subject matters to you and you want more deep historical investigations like this, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The raids that produced her began not as sudden ferocity, but as a business decision. In the late 8th through the 10th centuries, communities in Scandinavia were increasingly integrated into long-distance networks of trade, credit, and risk. Chiefs and entrepreneurs pooled wealth, silver, livestock, timber, to outfit fast, versatile vessels. The longship was not merely a war machine. It was a tool of mobility and investment. A low-draft hull that could slip across shallow coasts and thread rivers, carry dozens of men and captives, and return laden with goods that converted quickly into wealth. Financing was pooled because the returns could be high and the danger considerable. A successful raid might yield livestock, metalwork, sacks of coin, but the most portable and profitable commodity was people. Markets in coastal towns and river hubs had buyers who sought laborers, domestic servants, concubines, and the children they produced. Raiders scoped targets strategically, isolated monasteries at dawn, coastal fishing hamlets at low tide, river towns where merchants and traders clustered, places where the vulnerable were concentrated and resistance limited. The logistical picture helps explain the scale. A raid began with reconnaissance, knowledge of tides, knowledge of where wealth and people congregated. Ships were fitted for speed and cargo. Crews were organized not merely for battle, but for capture, transport, and exchange. Captured groups were marched, often under armed guard, from the place of seizure to the ship, loaded into cramped holds or lashed to benches, then rushed across sea lanes to markets where buyers would inspect bodies as they would animals or cloth. The voyage itself was part of the cost. Crowded decks, disease spreading in tight quarters, insufficient food and water. Some died en route. Others arrived so weakened that they sold for less, another brutal accounting. This was a commerce governed by language and law that stripped a person of status. In Norse legal codes and vernacular speech, terms such as thrall, Old Norse threll, made the person into property. Thralls had no standing to speak in court on equal terms. Their testimony was suspect or worthless. The Icelandic law code known as Gragas outlines the ways bondage intersected with daily legal life, what a thrall could or could not own, the limits of redress, and how status passed through generations. Where freeborn men had recourse to oath-swearing, and kinship protection, a thrall's voice was silenced or discounted. Laws could validate the sale of a woman as property. Customs would enforce that validation with violence and with silence. The cultural machinery of dehumanization was not merely legal jargon. It was ritualized in speech and practice, the renaming of captives, the assignment of a position in a household economy, the framing of a woman's body as a resource for textile production, childcare, or concubinage. The sagas, retellings shaped by generations, sometimes record household economies in which thralls do the spinning, weaving, and cultivation that support free households. Those narratives, written later and by free men, rarely preserve the perspectives of the enslaved. In the absence of their voices, material traces begin to speak. The journey from capture to market was a sequence of humiliations and dangers. Chroniclers' annals and traveler accounts, combined with archaeology, allow us to map the route. Coastal raids often funneled captives toward urban markets. Dyflin, known to us as Dublin. Birka on the Swedish archipelago. Hubs along the Volga where Scandinavian traders met Arab and Turkic merchants. On the Volga, at points where the North met the Islamic world, commerce in human beings was one part of a broader exchange in furs, hides, silver, and slaves. Markets were public spaces where captives could be inspected and priced. They were also scenes where sexual ownership became visible and performative. An eyewitness who traveled the Volga in the 10th century, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, left a striking record. He described arriving among a group of people Europeans later called the Rus. In his account, paraphrased with careful attention to context, he witnessed gatherings in which women who had been captured were presented openly, their bodies and social status displayed for buyers and for the group's male leaders. He reported behaviors that signaled both ownership and the social acceptance of sexual use, actions that would have been scandalous if judged by other contemporary societies, but were normalized within the transactions he observed. Ibn Fadlan's narrative is neither universal proof nor a complete ethnography. Scholars stress caution in extrapolating from a single observer. Yet his testimony aligns with other sources and the archaeological record, producing a pattern that suggests systematic sexual appropriation tied to market practices. Markets mattered not just because they converted people into goods, but because they set the terms of life thereafter. Some captives, rarely those of status or with wealthy kin, could be ransomed. Others, branded as property, became the labor backbone of households. Textile production, in particular, was a common role for enslaved women. Archaeologists have found spindle whorls and loom weights in settlement layers where thralls would have worked. And osteological analyses show stress markers on women's bones consistent with repetitive, forceful labor. Enthesopathies at forearm attachment points, spinal wear indicative of sustained bending, and indicators of malnutrition in childhood growth patterns. Isotopic studies of bone chemistry chart different diets. Free elites consumed more animal protein and imported foodstuffs. Enslaved individuals often show isotopic signatures of a poorer, grain-based diet. The legal and social status of women in bondage had specific contours. Concubinage, called frilla in Old Norse, allowed powerful men to acquire sexual partners without the full social obligations of marriage. Children born from such unions, fruborn, occupied precarious places in inheritance and social ranking. A fruborn might be recognized and cared for, or they might be denied claims to property and status. In cultures where lineage and kinship structured everything from land ownership to legal protection, the condition of being born into no recognized kin network perpetuated vulnerability across a lifetime. Material culture and osteology corroborate the human costs. In burial mounds and household refuse, archaeologists have recovered items that imply a life of forced labor. Coarse tools, signs of repair, domestic rubbish in larger than expected quantities. In urban cemetery populations at market towns, differences emerge in skeletal health between presumed free and unfree individuals, evidence of early wear, nutritional stress, and higher rates of certain kinds of infection. The textual record, when read with caution, echoes this. Monastery annals lament the loss of sisters and laywomen to coastal raids. Legal codes treat possession and exchange as routine. When these strands are woven together, a coherent picture emerges of an economy that normalized the violent commodification of people. Sexual exploitation was built into these arrangements, though the forms it took were varied and the sources uneven. Some women were taken as domestic servants, working within households where they cooked, cleaned, tended children, and produced textiles. Others were kept as concubines, socially marked sexual partners with no marriage rights. The evidence indicates that in many settings, sexual access to enslaved women was assumed by household heads and could be asserted by buyers at market. Archaeological remains and law codes suggest that sexual use could be both an everyday imposition and a symbol of ownership, a violent marking of property that erased prior family ties. The lives of children born to these relationships complicate the story. Genetic studies over the past decades, particularly analyses of mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lineages, have revealed striking asymmetries in early medieval settlement populations. In Iceland, for instance, mtDNA patterns indicate a disproportionate contribution from Gaelic-speaking populations in the maternal line, far exceeding what one would expect if the settlers had come in equal numbers from the Scandinavian homelands. Scholars interpret this as evidence that the women who populated early Icelandic communities were, to a significant extent, of Irish or Gaelic origin, many likely taken during raids in the Irish Sea region and transported across the North Atlantic. Men's Y chromosome lineages display a much more Scandinavian profile. The genetic picture, taken alongside textual testimony and material culture, suggests that expansion and settlement often involve the transfer of women's bodies across cultural borders as a routine aspect of colonization. Not all captured women ended in perpetual bondage. Some elites could be ransomed. Chronicles occasionally record payments exchanged for the return of a noble captive. Other rare cases show manumission, documents, runestones, and saga episodes where former thralls are freed and integrated. But these were exceptions, and their rarity only underscores the rule. For most, capture created a durable, often hereditary condition of servitude. At the most extreme end of the spectrum lay ritualized forms of death. Accounts like Ibn Fadlan's describe dramatic funerary rites in which human attendants or concubines were killed to accompany the dead. Archaeology provides corroboration in certain ship burials and richly furnished graves where human remains accompany high-status individuals. An entourage of servants and animals interred with a leader in a ceremony that fused wealth, power, and the symbolic disposal of people. Notable excavations, such as the Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials in Norway, reveal complex funerary economies. There remains debate among scholars about whether these are systematic practices across the region or exceptional, localized rites. Archaeological evidence cautions against broad generalizations. Some burials include human remains that could be interpreted as sacrifice. Others reflect symbolic association rather than routine slaughter. Still, when read alongside contemporary narratives and traveler testimony, these finds point to situations in which the death of one could be ritually linked to the disposability of others. To grasp how normalized these practices became, consider the vocabulary of law and daily life. Words that formalized status, thrall, bondwoman, manumission, structured social possibilities. Legal codes regulated transactions. They set prices for people of different ages and skills, described the rights of a buyer, and enumerated the limited remedies available to the enslaved. These texts were not simply descriptive. They participated in making the social order legitimate. When the law frames a human being as property, it constrains imagination. How does a society conceive of rights, kinship, and reciprocity when a human life is commodified in statute? The economics reinforced the law. Slavery, like any profitable system, created incentives to perpetuate and expand. A successful market in human labor lowered the marginal cost of expansion. New settlements could be supplied with domestic workers. Urban centers could grow dependent on coerced labor for craft and industry. Households could increase production through unpaid textile work. The spread of silver and coinage across Scandinavian regions, along with increased settlement activity, correlates with archaeological indicators of marketplaces and craft specialization, an infrastructural scaffolding on which the trade and people operated. The moral question, how a culture that produced exquisite wood carvings and meticulous craftwork could also systematize human suffering, has occupied scholars and public imagination. The answer lies in the normalization of structural violence. When economic incentives, legal sanction, and social ideology converge, brutality becomes routine. Dehumanization is a social technology. It allows people to perform, complicity to spread, and atrocities to be absorbed into daily life. For the captured woman on that drakkar, the consequence was a loss of kinship protections, a reclassification into a legal category that reduced her capacity to assert personhood, and an entry into a household economy that could demand sex as a function of property. We return to evidence, hard, messy, and cautious, to understand proportions, not sensationalism. Osteological analyses indicate higher rates of stress and wear among certain cemetery populations. Isotopes chart dietary differentiation along lines that correspond to presumed status. Mitochondrial DNA suggests asymmetric maternal ancestry in colonizing populations like Iceland. Coins, weights, and imports in settlements reveal market integration. Law codes such as Gragas record legal frameworks that assume and regulate human possession. Contemporary annals and sagas, imperfect and morally framed by their authors, recount raids and the removal of people. Traveler accounts like Ibn Fadlan's provide outsider observation of practices that may appear extreme, but align with other evidence. Together, the record does not produce a single portrait. It produces a convincing pattern. Raids, markets, and social structures work together to make human capture a systematic practice, and women were central to this economy. There were variations in experience based on place and time. In some urban centers, enslaved women became skilled craftswomen whose production underpinned household wealth. In rural contexts, they supplied labor essential to agricultural survival. In certain elite households, some concubines could accumulate influence if their children were recognized. In many other cases, their progeny remained marginalized. The ambiguity of status, sometimes recognized, sometimes denigrated, was itself a tool of control. Where social mobility existed, it was exceptional and often reliant on the goodwill of powerful patrons, an unstable and precarious pathway. The psychological consequences, the loss of name, memory, and kin, are harder to measure, but no less real. An individual stripped of kin networks and legal recourse entered a social limbo. The sagas occasionally preserve moments of dignity, resistance, or cunning by enslaved women, instances where agency surfaces in constrained forms. But for most, agency was limited, and the social memory of their lives was either erased or rewritten by those who held the pen and the law. This is where the title's claim crystallizes. They captured her alive, and what they did next: convert her body into a tradable asset, strip her rights, subject her to enforced labor and sexual use, and in some cases, sacrifice her in ritual contexts, resulted in a living death. Death would at least end suffering. What these systems engineered was a condition in which life itself was impoverished, restricted, and publicly owned. The final, stark convergence of evidence is genetic and archaeological. The maternal line DNA in early Icelandic populations demonstrates a demographic pattern, consistent with the movement of women from Gaelic zones to Norse-settled islands. This is not a romance of migration. It is the imprint of gendered movement in which men's and women's origins diverged in source. The material record in markets and settlements, weights, scales, diverse imported goods, speaks to networks that monetized people. The osteological wear and isotopic contrasts testify to dietary and labor differentials. Written sources, while biased and partial, describe practices in their own language. Traders, lawmen, and travelers recording what they saw or legislated. When historians synthesize these threads, they reach a morally uncomfortable conclusion. Economic growth and expansion were, at least in part, fed by a steady stream of human captives, many of them women, whose lives were altered irrevocably. This conclusion demands humility, but also action in how we remember the past. Popular images that cast Vikings as romantic explorers or noble warriors obscure the structural violence that enabled settlement and wealth. Recognizing the role of slavery and sexual exploitation in that history does not flatten cultural complexity. It enriches our understanding by refusing to sentimentalize. It forces us to see the human cost hidden beneath ship prows and rune stones. Remembering the captured matters because memory shapes the moral imagination. Acknowledging past injustices does not mean reducing a culture to its worst acts. but it does mean refusing to celebrate without scrutiny. When museums, textbooks, and media present the past, they choose which lives to highlight and which to render invisible. The archaeological and genetic testimony offers a means of reclamation. Voices without names speaking through bones and bloodlines, insisting on recognition. As we close, think of that 17-year-old again, not as an anonymous statistic, but as a person caught in the machinery of expansion. Her life offers a lens for us to see how systems of profit and law can co-author brutality. It asks of us to question neat legends and to center the experiences of the vulnerable in our histories. Where once storytellers exalted raiding as a source of identity, we can now add to the narrative the ledger of cost, women whose labor and bodies underwrote new settlements, whose descendants carried mixed lineages across seas, and whose erasure persisted in law and literature. We should not end on despair, but on responsibility. Scholarship can be a form of care, excavating the facts, naming the structures, and restoring dignity in the record. Museums and educators can introduce nuance. Public historians can lift the voices that were silenced. And viewers, by learning and sharing, can help ensure that memory includes those who were captured alive, and that our understanding of the past holds space for the full range of human consequences. If this moved you, share this video and check the description for sources and further reading.